In this video, we're going to use Maya to model and UV unwrap, then we'll use Photoshop to create a texture for this simple treasure chest asset. We'll start with the polygon cylinder. We can rotate it on its side. We can use J to snap our rotations, or type 90 in the channel box. I'll go ahead and move it up. Alright, I'm going to change the inputs to 10 on the subdivision axis, so that way it's a lower resolution. We're going really simple with this on purpose, so that way we can quickly take it through the whole process. Alright, so that's going to be the top half of the treasure chest. Now I'm going to delete these bottom faces, so right click, go to face mode. I can hit space to go into my different viewports here, and then I can do a marquee selection to grab the bottom half. We can hit 4 to check, make sure we have everything, 5 to go back to shaded, and then we'll delete those faces. Now I'm going to extrude these edges. We can turn the grid off so we can see better. If I right click, go to edge mode, I can double click to grab the edge loop here. And then now I can do shift right click, extrude edge, or in this newest version of Maya, I can hold down shift with my move tool and extrude like this. If you don't have the newest version, you would shift right click, extrude edge, and then you can use your extrude tool to move it down. I'll hit Q to exit the extrude tool. So we'll double click to make sure we have the border edge selected, shift right click, fill hole. Almost done. Last thing, we need to create an edge going from here to here, because this is not a four-sided face, it's an n-gon. So to draw in a new edge, we can use our multi-cut tool. We can go to, in the modeling menu, we can go to Mesh Tools, Multi-cut, and then we'll hover over this vertice to start there, and then hover over the corresponding vertice. That will draw the line. Then we can right click to finish the line, and then hit Q to go back to our select tool. Alright, now we can adjust the sizing of this. I'll turn my grid back on so I can get a better sense of things. Right click, go to vertex mode, and here we can change the sizing of it, if we want to change the height of it. Make it however you want. When we're done, we can right click, go back to object mode. If your pivot's in a wacky spot, you can go to modify, center pivot, or click the button here on your poly modeling shelf. Alright, and there we have our treasure chest model. Before we move on to the UV unwrapping stage, we should just clean up the model by giving it a name, freezing the transformations, and deleting the history. Next, we're going to UV unwrap the model. So select your treasure chest. We'll go to UV editor. That'll open up our UV editor and our UV toolkit. I like to keep them docked together. We can come over here and turn on shaded by clicking on this button. So now our shells will be filled in with blue, and they're a little easier to see. Now if we look at our checkerboard pattern, our UVs are not very good. They're not laid out in an even manner. The checkerboard is skewed and squashed. So what we want to do is reproject our UVs to create brand new ones. So to do this, we're going to go to Create, Automatic. This will do a 6-sided projection of our object and give us these different UV shells. If we check it out with the checkerboard pattern on there, it looks a lot better. There's still a little bit of skewing, but we'll take care of that later. So now we need to lay these out in a way that makes sense, because the automatic map isn't the end of the road. There's still fixing that we need to do. So first we can reorient these shells So we'll rotate this one. Remember, you can use J to snap your rotations. Then we'll move these out of the way. Now then for these, we want to orient them in a way that makes sense. Right now, they're standing up on their side, and when we texture it, we would prefer it laying the orientation that the treasure chest is. So we'll rotate these. We'll have this one match. We'll move these and space them out. So the next thing we want to do is adjust our UV shells. I would prefer if this was its own UV shell, so that way I could texture this part by itself, just like how this is its own UV shell. And then this whole top section could be a UV shell by itself, and then this could be by itself. So right now, the top area of the treasure chest is spread between these 3 different UV shells. So what we need to do is cut these faces from each other. So we'll right click, go to edge mode. We can select the edge in the viewport, or we could grab it in the UV shell. When we have it selected, we'll do shift right click, cut. And we're shift right clicking in the UV editor. If we shift right click in the modeling viewport, we'll get different options. Our modeling tools, if we shift right click in the UV editor, we get our UV tools. So we'll shift right click, cut, and now you can see that it's bolded, meaning that it is a seam edge. So we can right click and go to UV shell mode, and then just see that they're separated. Now what I want to do is sew these together. So I'll right click, go to my edge mode. Edge mode is where we do any of our cutting and sewing. I'll select the edge, do shift right click, move and sew. We don't want to just do regular sew because that won't actually move them together. So we want to make sure we do move and sew. Now there are buttons here on to the right, cut and sew buttons. Cut is regular. The sew button will not do the moving. So if you want to use these buttons, you're going to have to click stitch together. That's the move and sew button. Alright, so now these are separated out. So I'm going to do the same thing for the other side, where I'll cut this edge. Now they're separated. So I'll grab this seam and sew them together. Now I have a UV shell that's just these top faces. Alright, now we should take a look at our checker pattern to see if there's any skewing, anything that's not proportional. So right here, this area is kind of getting stretched. So to fix this, we can grab the UV shell, and over here on the right there's a section called Unfold with different unfolding tools, and that will flatten out, relax, and space out our UVs to be more proportional. So the first one's pretty good, optimize. That one will just stretch them out, and we can see our checkerboard pattern. That does a good job. The one underneath it, Unfold, isn't bad either. It's very similar. If I were to undo and do it again, Unfold, very similar. Alright, so all of these other ones look okay. I don't think there's any skewing there. So we just want to make sure we give our model a once over, and anything that's stretched out or squashed, we go ahead and unfold it. So the last thing we'll do is we need to get these guys to fit into the 0 to 1 space, which is this quadrant right here. There's all this space here, but our texture is going to show up here. Now we can manually move them here. We just want to make sure that we resize them to where they'll fit nicely. And then we want to lay them out in a way that makes sense, like keeping similar items together. We don't want them to spill out of the 0 to 1 space, and then we also don't want them to overlap with each other. Now there is an option over here in Arrange and Layout that can automatically lay these out in here, but what happens is that it will also rotate them. You can go to Shift and click on this button, and that will open up the options. It's also somewhere in these menus. If we go to Modify Layout, then we have the little square option button. But here on the buttons, it's Shift click. Now here you can give it some settings, like we could say none for the rotate, and then now it'll keep the rotation the way we set it up. This can be a quick way to just make them fit in here, but as you can see, the result isn't super smart. It just kind of crammed them in there. So instead, we can just move them ourselves. So these two side faces I'm going to have here, looks like they're a little bit too big to fit, so I'll scale everybody down together so that way I'm not resizing them individually. And then let's see, I'll put these here. Looks like this could be a little bit bigger just to match up with the sizing. Okay, maybe I could scale these up a little bit more. And so we want to leave some space in between the shells, some space in between the edges of the 0 to 1 space. And I'm saying 0 to 1, 0 to 1. Alright, so that's a pretty good amount of space that it's taking up. We have some wasted space here, but that's okay. That's just a compromise. At least we are taking up as much as we can, while still keeping the checkerboard pattern proportional. Alright, so the next thing we need to do is save this out to an image, so that way we can throw it into Photoshop. So for this process, we need to be in object mode. Of course, make sure you have it selected, and then you can go to Image, UV Snapshot. It's kind of like saving out a render. You have to choose the location. By default, it's going to put it in the Images folder because this is an output kind of file. It's something that's coming out of Maya, which means it goes in the Images folder. By default, it names it Out UV. And we should probably change that because if we had multiple items, we wouldn't want it to overwrite our files. So we'll call this chest underscore UV. Save. So we've given it a name. Next, we'll give it the file format. JPEG is fine for this. PNG is also good. Now here we can change the size. Since we're texturing, we want to make sure that this is going to be the same size as our texture. And typically, we use power of two numbers, like 256, 512, 1024, or 2048. So in this case, I'm going to keep it kind of simple and do a 1K map, which would be 1024. We can change the edge color, but for now we'll just leave it alone so we can see what the default looks like. Alright, so we gave it a name, file format, a size, then we can hit apply and close. You'll see down here that it's saved the file. If it gives you an error, that's because perhaps you're not in object mode. So make sure you go to object mode and do it again. So if we look in our folder, now in the images folder, we have a JPEG showing off our chest UVs. So you want to check that out, make sure it matches up. If there are problems here, we want to go back and fix it, and then we would have to re-save this out. Next, we're going to create our texture using Photoshop. There are a lot of different texturing programs out there, and in this case, we'll try out Photoshop. So we'll navigate over here. We're going to open up that chest UV in Photoshop. And throughout this process, we're going to go back and forth between Photoshop and Maya. To get started, we can go to File, Open in Photoshop, and navigate to your UV file. Your chest UV should be in the Images folder, so we'll open that up. Alternatively, we could click and drag to open up our files. Now, we don't want to use this as our texturing file. Instead, we're going to save out a Photoshop file. So to do that, we'll go to File, Save As. And then because this is going to be a texture that's going into Maya, we're going to drop this into our Source Images folder. Now we'll give it a new name because this isn't our UV layout. This is going to be our diffuse texture. That's the type of map that this is going to be. Now for our type, we'll choose a Photoshop document, or PSD. Okay, we'll save it. Now before we start texturing with this, let's plug this into Maya so we can see our progress. So back in Maya, I have my object, and I want to go ahead and assign a brand new material to it. So we have our object selected. We'll hold down right click, go to Assign New Material. That's going to give me the list of all my materials. In this case, I'm going to choose a Lambert. That's a really basic material, but I'm doing so on purpose because it's a flat shader, so that way I won't have a glare in the way if I'm trying to look at my texture file. Alright, now that'll pop open our attribute editor, and the material is all the way to the right. It's the rightmost tab. Now you may have a bunch of tabs, and that's because as we accumulate history, we accumulate more tabs. And at this point, we don't really need this history anymore. This was just us UV unwrapping. So we might as well delete our history, clear that, which will then clear our extra tabs. Okay, I'll navigate over to my new Lambert. First, I'll give it a name, so that way we can stay organized. Now we need to plug in that PSD file. So in our color channel, over here on the right, we'll click on the checker button. Now it'll ask us what we were trying to plug in there. In this case, we were trying to put in a file. So we'll choose File. That'll open up a file here. We're going to browse to it. And that should automatically go to our Source Images folder if we're using a project structure and our project is set. I'll choose the PSD, click Open. Now we may not see it right away. We need to hit 6 to go to texture mode. 4 wireframe, 5 shaded, 6 texture. And there we go. We can see our texture on here. So as we're working in Photoshop, it may update automatically, or we may need to come over here to the color and reload it, so that way we can see how it's going on our model. Next, let's set this up so we can begin texturing. This is set to a background layer. To make it into a regular layer, you can just click on the lock. Now double click so I can rename this UV, so I know it's my UV layer. I'm going to select it so it's my active layer, and if I go to Image, Adjustments, Invert, or Control I can invert it and swap the colors. Now what I'm going to do is change this layer's blending mode, which is in this drop down, to multiply. And that will make it so that way the white will become transparent, but these lines will always show up. So I'm going to keep this layer at the top of the stack, and then as I texture, I'll have my designs and whatnot on a layer underneath, and then this will always show up and the white will just get covered up. So that way this can be our guide while we're working, and we can just place content underneath it. So first I'm going to create a new layer. We do that by clicking here on this square button. Then we can drag it to change the layer order. I'm going to fill this in with the base color, which is the color that we see most here. So I'll go to my color picker here and choose brown. Then I can use my paint bucket over here on the toolbar and then click to fill in this layer. I'll double click and I'll name this base. Now I want to break things up into different layers so that way I'm working non-destructively, and that way I'm not just painting on top of the same layer. So I'll click on the new layer button, and I'm going to draw out some gold trim around these areas. So I'm going to use the rectangle marquee tool to grab selections and then fill it in with a color. So first I'll just grab this whole thing. If I want to take away from my selection, it's Alt. If I want to add to my selection, it's Shift. So for now, I'll just drag out a box. Then I'm going to fill it in with gold. So I'll come over here to my color picker, choose a color, go to the paint bucket, and fill it in. Now what I'll do is I'll use the marquee tool to grab a selection and delete it. So if I click and hold, I can switch over to the elliptical marquee tool. That way I can get circular selections. And what I'll do, I'm going to hit Z to zoom in. And then I'll go back to my marquee tool. The keyboard shortcut for that is M. So if I click and drag from the middle here, it doesn't really draw out the circle. If I hold down Shift, it gives me a perfect circle. And then if I were to add Alt to this, it would then grow from the area that I clicked. So by default, when we click and drag, it goes from the corner and grows outwards. So if we add Alt, we hold down Alt, now it'll grow from that area we clicked. So then to make a perfect circle, I'll hold down Shift at the same time. So I'm holding down Shift and Alt, and that can get a nice circle here. There we go. I hit the delete key to delete that selection. So now I have a nice circular area here. Next, I'll go back to my rectangular marquee tool, and I'll just select a box here. I may need to zoom in. I'm hitting Z to go to the magnifying glass. Okay, that looks good. And then I'll delete that selection. To deselect, we can hit Control D or go to Select, Deselect. Now in Photoshop, we can put effects on our layers by double-clicking on the layer, and then we get our Layer Styles window. There are a lot of different effects out there. If you click on them and they give you some different results, you can say Reset to Default, and that will reset them to their default settings. So there are things like bevel, there are things like strokes, glowing, shadows, inner shadows, different effects that we can utilize in our work. I'm going to go ahead and just play around, and I'll put a stroke on this and have it be kind of a darker gold color. Just add a fun shape there. And then when we can play with the size of the stroke here. Any of these layer styles in the middle, that's where there's usually sliders and drop downs and settings that we can play with. We could change the position of how this grows, if it goes inside, outside, or in the center. That's going to change how it grows. Okay, I think that looks good. I'll click OK. Oh, you know what? I want to have another gold bar right here. So I'll go to my marquee menu again, or my marquee tool, click and drag out a box, and then fill that in with yellow or gold. Now you'll see that my layer style was added to that selection, because layer styles are just effects that are being added onto your layer. If we wanted to change that, we would just double click on this area where it says effects, and we can go back to our layer style and change it at any time. Alright, let's see how this is looking in Maya. So I'll hit Control S to save my Photoshop file. Then I'll open up Maya. So in Maya, we need to reload the texture. So I'll come over here to Color Channel, Reload. I'll take a look at it to see how it's going. It's looking okay. One thing to note though is that whenever we're looking at our texture, in the end we don't want these black lines to be there. That's just our guidelines to help us figure out, where to lay the texture out in Photoshop. So whenever we're looking at it in Maya, we should hide this layer, then save it, and then go back to Maya. So that way we get a better looking result. Alright, so back to Photoshop. I'll put that UV back on. Now there's a lot of repeating elements here, right? These two are the same, these two are the same. So we can go ahead and duplicate this element and bring it over here. To duplicate a layer, you can right click on it and then say duplicate. Then you hit OK, and that makes a copy in the same spot, and then you can just... Now if you're like me and you tried to move it and you accidentally grabbed your UV, we could either lock our UVs so that way we don't grab them anymore, or our move tool has a special mode turned on that says auto select, so that means it will jump to whatever layer you're clicking on. So I think I'll just go ahead and lock my UV layer for right now by clicking on the little lock button. You can hold down the Alt key and click and drag this layer downwards and create a copy and move it at the same time. Just different ways to do things. Now we'll go ahead and repeat these steps for this area. So I'm going to make a new layer, drag out a rectangle, fill it in with gold, drag out an interior rectangle, Now there are different ways to do this. I'm doing a very beginner-friendly way, but we could use a variety of our different tools to do this. I'll hit delete, and then we have this neat layer style effect on here, so we might as well put it on this. If we right-click on these existing layers, right-click on their layer style, we can say copy, and now we can paste the layer style to a new layer. If we had like 50 different layers, that would be a really quick way to just apply the same effect to everybody. Alright, I'll go ahead and duplicate this layer and then move it over. Now notice that whatever's over here, whatever's outside of our UV shell, it doesn't matter. We're only looking at what's inside of the shell. So it's okay that this sort of extends outward and that there's extra stuff happening here. Let's take a look in Maya. Alright, not bad. Alright, now I'm going to do the same thing for these. So this is looking okay, but it could look a little bit better. We could have it not just be so flat, and we could start adding a little bit more texture to it. So for example, I want this to be gold, so I want it to be kind of like metal. So we can incorporate photos into our work as well. We don't have to just be painting in Photoshop all the time. So I have this picture of metal. It's in my source images folder, and it's just this picture of a metal kind of board. So I'm just going to drag this into Photoshop, and then I'll scale it up just so that way it fits over the whole thing. I'll hit enter to place it. Now you can get photos from Google, wherever. There is a pretty neat website called textures.com. It's free to make an account. You can do like 15 downloads a day. And here they have a bunch of different textures that you can use for free, and you can use them for commercial work. So it's a really great resource. So that's where I got this image from. So you can go here and look for textures that you like. Okay, so back here I have my metal base, and basically what I want to do is I want to like project this onto the gold parts. Now I'm going to go ahead and grab this metal base picture. I'm going to drag it above all of the gold layers, and what will make this easier is if I go ahead and group these gold layers together. Now to put them into a group, you can select the layers and then create a group, and that will drop them in there. If you leave somebody out, you can always click and drag and drop them into the group. And so now we can collapse it, and that kind of clears up the layers a little bit so that way we have more space and it's not getting so crowded. And then this group, to make things easier, we can name this gold parts so that way we know what's in there. Now if I want this metal base to only show up where these gold parts are, I can select this layer, and if I right click I can create a clipping mask, and that will look down at the folder beneath it, and the selection of all of these different layers, it will look at that and it will only show up wherever the pixels are that are in this layer. So if we wanted to get rid of that, we would right click, release clipping mask, right click, create clipping mask. The metal base just has to be on top of that folder. Now then, that's just totally covered up my gold though, right? So what I could do is I could use a blending mode to grab the details of this metal image, but still get my gold coloring. So with that metal base layer selected, we'll come over here to our blending modes, and I'll choose multiply. Now if we're not sure which one to choose, we could always just click normal and see how it's highlighted blue. Now we can just use our arrow keys and go down the list and see what we like. Maybe you want to choose a different one that's not multiply. Some of these other ones are okay. Some of them are kind of funky, some of them are weird, don't do anything. In this case, multiply is just the one that I liked the best. And so now it's preserving my color, but I still get this fun textured, and I get these little imperfections that otherwise I couldn't really paint in, or it would take a long time to paint. So let's see, I'm going to hide my UV layer, I'll save this, and check it out in Maya. Nice, that's looking a lot cooler. Now another thing we could do to just make this stand out a little bit more, because it is sort of compressed somewhat, this particular layer, we could do a filter sharpen on it to make it kind of pop a little bit more. So if I turn that on and off, you can see the difference. It just adds some contrast between those pixels and just kind of makes it stand out. It does sort of make it more pixelated somewhat, so if we were really going to be up close to this object, maybe it was for like a first-person game, maybe we wouldn't want to do that, but in this case, if it's a treasure chest that we're going to be this close to, perhaps, it kind of just helps those details pop out more. So I went ahead and named my layers here. Now next up, I want to make a fun like keyhole on one of these sides. So that's going to be part of the, it's going to be a gold area. So I'll make a new layer inside of the gold folder, so that way it'll have these same effects and have this same like texturing to it. And then I'll hit Z to go to my magnifying glass and just zoom in here. I can hit space to pan. Okay, now I just want to create a box and then I'll fill it in with gold. So I'll go to my marquee menu, drag out a box, maybe right about this size. Now I'll fill that in, deselect. If I want to move it, I can use my move tool. I can hit V to go to the move tool, and then move it, or I can use my arrow keys to nudge it around. Okay. Now I want to put some effects to make this feel like it's a little more three-dimensional. So I'm going to double click to go to my layer styles. If we check these on, they turn on, but they don't let us see the settings. So you want to make sure you click on the words so that way you can see this section here. I'm going to reset this. Now bevel will add a light and a dark to it. What we can do is play with these sliders. So if we change the size, we could soften it, make it a little bit harder, play with the depth. Now we can also change the highlight color. Right now the highlight is white, and maybe we want to make it more yellowy. We could do that. Alright, I think that looks fine. So I'll click OK. So now it just has a little bit more depth to it. Now I want to go ahead and create a keyhole shape. So I'm going to do that on a separate layer. I'll make a new layer here. And then I'm going to paint that in. So I'll hit B to go to my paintbrush. Now you can always just brush a little bit to see what it looks like. Right now it's using a soft brush, which means it's feathered at those edges. So I want to come up here to the top, and basically I could pick a hard brush so that way it'll fill in this whole area. I'm hitting Control Z to undo, just as I test these out. Just as a little note, to undo multiple times in Photoshop, it's Control Alt Z. And if you ever forget, you can go to Edit, and there's the shortcuts here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and pick a darker color, like a darker version of this gold. So I could maybe even sample some of these darker colors in here. Or I could just pick my own. And then I'll adjust my brush size to be maybe about 20. And that's going to be the round part of the keyhole. So I'll click to draw that in. If you want to go bigger, you can. You can also use your bracket keys to change the size. Now then I'll lower my brush size to maybe something like 15, 10. And there we go. So now I have my key shape. So that's looking okay, but it could have a little bit more depth to it. So what we'll do is this key layer, we'll double click on it so we can go to our layer styles. And in here, there is an inner shadow layer style. Let's click on that one. That will add the effect of having an inner shadow, which will give us this depth and make it feel like this is going inside here. So we could play with this. You can adjust the angle here. or you can actually click and drag and move it around. So maybe if I wanted it to be kind of not coming from a particular direction, just sort of going upwards or downwards, we could do something like that, and then we can play with the distance, the size, the choke. I think that looks pretty good. Whether or not we want it to be darker or lighter by making it more transparent. That looks good to me. So I'll click OK. Nice. Let's check this out in Maya. So I'll save it. Alright, that's looking pretty cool. It's looking a little bit more interesting there, has a little bit more depth to it. Now something that's a little flat is there's not really any depth or shading between this gold area and this brown area. So we could paint in a little bit of shadow here, so that way it feels like there's depth. So to paint this shadow, I'm going to go ahead and close this folder, and I will make a new layer. It's going to be outside of the folder, it's going to be on top of the base, but below the folder. Double click and I'll call this shadows. And then I'm going to take my paintbrush and I'm going to use a soft brush so that way it's really feathered. So it's really kind of feathery like that. And then we'll paint with black. So we'll grab this, we can choose black on our color picker. Then I'm just going to go through here and just kind of paint an edge around here. Now we can hold down Shift, remember, to get a straight line. Now this is really over the top right now, but we're doing that on purpose. We're going to actually dial it down. And so notice how I'm not painting just right up in here. I'm kind of using the edge of my brush. So I'm just getting that feathery part. Now we could maybe do the same thing with the layer style, but we're just seeing different techniques here. Okay, now that's pretty intense. So what I'm going to do though is I'm going to grab this layer and then use opacity to just dial it down, so to make it more transparent. That looks okay. You can always go in and edit this stuff. You can use your eraser, E, or this eraser tool right here, and kind of erase anything. Or we can repaint stuff, whatever we need to do. Let's check this out in Maya. Ooh, okay, that's looking better, right? Now we're having a little bit of depth there. We could be a little bit more precise. It's a little broad right here, so we would just want to clean that up. Now the next thing I'm going to do is create my own custom wood grain. Now of course we can get pictures from textures.com or Google, but just so we can see the process, I want to use filters to create some wood grain. So I'm going to create a new layer. That's going to be above the base but below the shadows. Now what we're going to do is we'll fill this in with brown, but basically we're going to go to our color picker here and then we can sample this brown that we were using. And let's see, so I want to kind of get two different tones here, so we can use this one. Maybe we can go a little lighter. And then in this background color slot, so my second color picker slot, I'll sample the brown again, and then I'll go for something a little darker. So we're going to basically use these two colors to make our wood grain. We can change it afterwards when we see what it looks like. So I'm going to go to my color picker, or excuse me, my fill bucket, and then I'll click to just paint this layer with at least something. It has to have something in it. Alright, so now we'll go to, with this layer selected, we're going to go to Filter, Render, Fibers. Now this is going to pop up a new window, and here we can play around with this and we can create a kind of a wood grainy texture. Now if we play with the different sliders here, we can get different results. This can be more of a bark kind of texture. If we were to lower the variance and higher the strength, it could be kind of a hair sort of texture. So you can play with this and see what you like. So I think I want to go for something kind of like this. I think that looks cool. So I'll click OK. And now it's going to fill it in with that. Now if you don't like your colors, you can come over here and change them. So we could choose something lighter, maybe. And then now fibers is going to be a shortcut right here. So we can just click this to do it again. Or you could, of course, you can always just go back to filter, render, fibers. And that way, if you want to play with your settings, you can. Okay, I like that. That's looking cool. Let's save it. Let's check it out in Maya. Now, an issue I have with this, right here it looks good. The fibers are going vertically, so it's like there's vertical planks. But if we think about it here, our planks are probably going to be laid out this way, horizontally. But the wood grain is laid out this way, so it's sort of weird. So right here, we would want to grab this and rotate it so that way it's going to be laying that across that way. So in Photoshop, let's make that edit. What I'm going to do basically is I'm going to make 2 of these layers, so I'll duplicate it. So I'll grab my layer, right click, duplicate. So I have 2 now, and I'm going to rotate this one. So to rotate a layer or some content, we can hit Control T for free transform. And then if we hover out here, you can see my arrow turns into this crooked arrow, and then I can click and drag and rotate it. If we hold down Shift, it'll snap. Then we let go. Then to place it, you can hit Enter or the checkbox here. There we go. So now I have one that is horizontal, and then underneath it, I have my vertical one. Now let's see. I kind of liked these being vertical. So what I'll do is I'm going to take my marquee tool. I'll select this one. I have the horizontal wood grain selected, and I'll just delete that. So that way I can still have the vertical part here. You can check that out in Maya. Nice. Now this wood grain looks cool and everything, but there's no planks to it. So it's not like our chest would be made out of just one big giant piece of wood. It would have those lines indicating that it was made out of planks. So on a new layer, we're going to paint in those plank lines. Now for this, I'm going to use the UV guides as a guideline to where I'm going to lay the planks out. We'll zoom in here since this is where we're going to be working with the top UV shell. I'm going to make a brand new layer, and I'll drag this layer on top of the wood grain, but below the shadows, some lines. Now what we're going to do is we're going to choose a light color and a dark color. So that'll be my light color. Then I'll hit B to go to my brush, and I'm going to make my brush very, very small. You can click and drag and test it out. Yeah, basically I just want a nice small line like this. So maybe just 2 pixels big. So I need it to be straight. I'm going to start out here just so that way I'm purposefully going a little bit more than I need. And I'll hold down Shift while I'm dragging so I get a straight line. Alright, then I can do it again. Click here, hold down Shift, drag it out. Next one, click, hold down Shift. Next one, click, Shift. Now at this point I have my lines, but it's a little hard to see them, so I'm going to turn the UV part off. And it looks okay, but basically what we have right now is the highlight, so the next thing we need is the shadow. So we'll go and we'll choose a dark color. So again, we could sample from here. Maybe choose something darker, test it out. That seems okay. Maybe we could go a little darker. Okay, I think I like that. So then I'm going to paint really closely next to it. Again, I'm going to hold down Shift, and that just creates this effect of there being a highlight and a shadow part. So I'll do the same thing over here. Hold down Shift and drag. Shift and drag. Shift and drag. Now then when we zoom out, we can see it a little bit better, but it's basically giving us the illusion of there being this beveling there. Now you could lower the opacity if you wanted to, just to have the wood grain show up a little bit in there, just to kind of have it blend slightly. And basically, you know, our chest is probably made up of the same sized planks throughout, so we could just duplicate this and sort of place it along these different areas. So I can right click and duplicate my layers, or I can use that alt clicking method to just move it and duplicate it. So I'll move this here. I may need to use my arrow keys to nudge it to a spot that I like. Okay, then I'll do the same thing for these sides. Just alt dragging it. Alright, then I'll do the next one here. And then I'll drag it over here for these guys. Now remember, these are vertical, so I need to rotate this. So I'll do Control T for my free transform. Rotate it. I'm holding down Shift to snap. Can move it. Let me hit Enter to apply my rotation. Whoops, looks like it's bleeding over here, so let me just move it up. Now see how it's a little bit long? It's kind of going into here, so we may need to just use our marquee tool to maybe just delete any excess stuff we don't need. Now duplicate this layer again. Alright, let's check it out in Maya. It's looking cool. Now you know what though? It looks like I might need to change around the order of this, where I think I want the highlight to be on this side, because let's imagine light was beaming down on this. This part would hit the light, and that part would be the shadow. So I'm going to need to flip that on these. We'll get a better looking result when we do that. So it's probably a good idea, but before we had duplicated it, we should have tested it out in Maya to see. Sometimes I like to use the eyeballs to help me find which layer is which. So here we go. This bottom one was the top. So what I'll do is, it's very simple. We're going to hit Control T, and then if I right click, I have the option to flip it. So I can say flip vertical, and that just flips it. We could also rotate it, but just different ways to do the same thing. Now I'll go to the next one, Control T, right click, flip, and the next one, Control T, flip vertical. That's already looking better, honestly. If we were to visualize it like it's this is the bottom and that's the top, that's already looking better. Control T, flip vertical. And then for these side ones, it might be okay. Let's take a look in Maya. So we'll save, let's reload. There we go, that looks a lot better already. See how the light would be hitting it, and then that would get a little shine, whereas that would be the shadowy part. Nice. I guess we would want to flip these so that way they're at least consistent with these. So since that one's dark light, then it's light dark. So just so that way we keep the consistency. So I'll go ahead and flip those. I'll flip them horizontal. Next one, flip it horizontal. Alright, that's looking good. So with that, I think we're done with our texture. We could go in and polish some stuff or add more detail. You can do whatever you like, really. But for now, I think I'm good with this, so I'll go ahead and save it. Now, the Photoshop file is our working file with all of our layers and such, but depending on what we're doing with this asset, maybe we're taking it into a game or we're going to animate with it, sometimes the Photoshop files can be kind of big, and also we just don't need to keep all this around. This is just for us to create our texture with. So, we're going to save this into an image file. We'll go to File, Save As, and then we'll change the type. Now, JPEGs are lower quality kind of images, so we usually don't use them for textures. PNGs are pretty good. They'll have transparency, so PNGs can be kind of a lower end but still good file. Targas are better quality and used sometimes. Then we have TIFFs, which can be used as well. Typically, I tend to just go with a PNG if I'm doing a diffuse texture like this. Now, I'll name it the same thing, chest_diffuse. It's in our source images folder. We'll save that out. Okay. And then in Maya, I can just plug in this new file. We'll go here. We'll browse to our new PNG, open that up, and take a look. Now, just as a random thing here, sometimes PNGs in our material, it'll hook up to the transparency channel. So if that happens to you, you can just right-click and say break connection. It would say that here. If I right-click on the color, we can see it, break connection. So if your PNG hooks up to the transparency channel and unintended results, then you can get rid of it. In this video, we've gone through and we've modeled something, UV unwrapped it, textured it, and seen an asset go through the whole pipeline.